All right, welcome to the Biology 101 online live video for today is microorganisms and fungi. We'll probably spend most of our time today on the microorganisms. There was a little bit more in that chapter, a little bit more to get into, and then we will take a brief break and transition over into the fungi. Starting off, these two groups today are not included together because of evolutionary relationships or anything like that. Everything we're talking about today in the microorganisms part is grouped together because it's small. Fungi was lumped in with this today simply because of space. It's a shorter chapter and we could combine these two things. So let's go ahead and get the PowerPoint going. We'll be doing some stuff on the whiteboard today and get started. If anybody has any questions, I have a monitor over here that I can use to look at what you're saying. Type them into the question box at the very end. If there's questions, there'll be an opportunity to speak them. I'll put your microphone on if you have one. So let's get going with our microbes, categories and importance. So all living things on Earth broken into three groups: bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. And their evolutionary relationships look a little something like this, where basically there's a universal ancestor, and we get the domain bacteria over here, and we have domain archaea and eukarya. And so interestingly, what you see here is that eukaryotes are more closely related to archaea. And we know that because of similarities between cell membranes and genetics. All the guys in these two groups here are single-celled organisms. Over here, we have single-celled and multicellular organisms. And so in protists, we'll find all single-celled. And over here, we're mostly going to have multicellular. So domain eukarya is divided into four kingdoms: Kingdom Protista, Kingdom Plantae, Kingdom Animalia, and Kingdom Fungi. Microbes are so small they cannot be seen with the naked eye. That's why we're lumping all these things together today. Not for any major theoretical reason or anything, but because what we're talking about are things that you really would need a microscope to see effectively. Microbes are important because they produce more than half the Earth's atmospheric oxygen, and bacteria and archaea are responsible for putting atmospheric nitrogen into a form plants can use. Here's something interesting. You think about a plant's roots absorbing things from the soil, they can't get raw nitrogen. And so what happens is bacteria are very important for plants because they'll turn that nitrogen into a form that they can use. And really, bacteria and fungi are very important as decomposers in the natural world. They break down dead organic matter and recycle the resulting elements back into the earth. Okay, so what do I mean by that? Let's take a moment to go to the board here. Recycling the elements back into the earth. So, you'll see something that we talked about before here, a little bit about the carbon cycle, but now we're going to expand it to talk about other nutrients in general. So, we start this out, and we've got the sun, right? It's a happy sun. It is providing light that enables plants to grow. And what's going on in this process while the plants are growing is they have the ground here, and they've got roots as well, right? And we've got them taking in, we talked about this last week, taking in CO2 and putting out O2. And so last week we talked about how that carbon that's missing, we go from CO2 to O2 because these carbons are being kept in the plants as carbohydrates. They're using them to build more plant mass. But that's not all. Plants are also taking things in from their roots. We've got other nutrients and things going into the plant, in their roots, and becoming part of the plant. And so let's imagine this plant we're talking about is a big tree growing in the forest, and it goes really tall, super tall tree here. We're just looking at the trunk. But then one day that tree's going to die, right? Tall tree trunk here is going to die, and it's going to fall on the ground. So here's a tree trunk, like here, there's a hole in it there. Okay, tree trunk dies, falls on the ground. What happens to it? Well, it's going to get decomposed because it was taking all of these nutrients and things out of the ground before, and it was actually locking them in. They were part of the plant. But when it dies, if it didn't decompose, they'd be locked in there. Think about if tree trunks didn't decompose in the forest. Every time a tree fell down, it would pile up, and there wouldn't be any space for anything. And so what happens is microbes come in. And what these microbes do is they slowly break down that wood. They actually use it for fuel. We'll talk about how they do that in a little bit. And they release those nutrients back into the ecosystem, into the soil. And so it kind of completes a cycle. Because once these are back into the soil, guess what they're available to do? Once they're back into the soil, they can be used by other plants again. Let's take a moment to consider this in the context of farming. Right? If you're let's imagine a farm. That's the ground on the farm, and we're growing corn. Right? This is what corn looks like. Okay? And what's going to happen here? Well, we're growing the corn. We're going to take off these ears, harvest them, and then the stalks we're going to knock down, and it's going to be like this again. Could we plant crops over and over and over again? No, we can't. We can't do that without fertilizer. Because what's happening is when you take this corn, these corn cobs away, those have nutrients in them. We have taken nutrients out of this ecosystem and they don't go back into the soil. And so what we need to do is apply fertilizer to the ground that puts those nutrients back in so that the corn plants can grow. And that's the purpose the decomposers serve in ecosystems. They break down organic matter, returning those basic elements to the system. And this doesn't have to be for just plants, because, right, an animal can eat a plant, right? But the same exact thing can happen. If an animal eats a plant and then dies, right, it too can be decomposed and have its things returned to the soil. So that is why microbes are important. They keep ecosystems functioning through their ability to decompose things. Microbes live in all environments in which larger life forms exist, and they are present in numbers so immense that the weight or biomass of all the microbes on Earth exceeds the biomass of all larger life forms. And to give you an example of this, look at your body. Your body is composed of cells. You can't see them. They're too small. But your body has a certain number of cells. And if I ask you how many cells in your body are your own cells, and how many of them are other cells that are just living on you or with you, you might say, well, there's a few living on you or with you. But that wouldn't be the correct answer. What's really going on is in your body, you have more bacterial cells than actually the number of your own cells. And this is because bacteria are so tiny that they can live in and on the cells of your body in incredible numbers, such that they outnumber your own cells. Viruses. Okay, viruses make a living by hijacking other cells. They can't necessarily carry out life's basic functions on their own, but that doesn't mean that they're not alive. There's some place between the border of living and not living. In fact, many, many scientists now, since the writing of this book, have started to consider them alive. And so what they're basically doing is hijacking another cell so that they can reproduce. They need to get the genetic material inside the host, make it turn out viral parts, and construct new virus particles from these parts, and then move the new particles out of the cell. All right, what do we mean by that? Let's go back to our whiteboard here and erase what we've done. Get rid of our sun and all that. We'll think about that. it. Okay, so what do we have going on? A virus. Well, if you remember, back early in the semester, we talked about the protein production path in a eukaryotic cell. Keep in mind, viruses can operate inside bacteria as well. Now we're going to consider their operation inside your own eukaryotic cells. So you have a cell here. And normally, what that cell is doing is it's got a nucleus, and that nucleus has DNA in there. And that DNA acts like the officer of a factory that is going to tell the cell what to make. And so what it does is it exposes this DNA that codes, as you remember, for a given protein, and it sends that code with RNA down to ribosomes located on the endoplasmic reticulum, like a factory, that make that protein, whatever this protein shape is here. It's done. Viruses are sneaky, and there's a lot of different ways they work. I'm going to give you one example here. In this case, what a virus will do is it will land on the side of a cell. And you can see different viruses in your book and stuff like that. Many of them have different shapes and stuff. My favorite ones are the ones that kind of look like little alien robots here. Something like that. There's lots of different shapes. What they do is they insert their DNA or RNA into the cell, and they hijack this process over here. Instead of telling the cell to make what the cell wants to make, what they're going to do is get the cell to make virus parts. And so what happens is it just makes more and more and more and more and more viruses. Some of them sneak out through the membrane. For other viruses, they fill up this whole cell, and then the cell bursts open, and all the viruses escape, going on to another cell that they can later infect. And so that's how viruses hurt you. And here's a key note about viruses. Viruses do not do bad things to you just for the heck of it, right? You get sick, you think about viruses, and you're like, oh, well, that's bad. That's a mean thing. Viruses get you sick in order to transmit themselves to other individuals. Think about it this way. How is a cold transmitted? By sneezing, right? It makes you sneeze because it wants to move to a new person. And so viruses are just trying to make a living and get by like any other organism. Just got to make a note here. Okay, so viruses have been in the news quite a bit lately because of, your book talks about H1N1, but now we've got Ebola, right? And you may have heard when people were talking about Ebola very recently in the news that people are working on a vaccine. And they're working on this vaccine in order to, ideally, you give somebody a vaccine and they can't get Ebola. But how does that work? First of all, as a little public service announcement, there are almost absolutely no risk associated with vaccines. So you shouldn't be worried about getting the disease when you get a vaccine for a given disease. They are dead. Vaccines contain dead or altered forms or even just some simple chemicals to make them work. Because here's how this happens. Let's take a graph here, and we're going to say this is time on this axis. And now I'm going to draw you two lines here. We're going to have virus numbers, and we're just going to call these, for today's purposes, immune system element numbers. Immune system element numbers. And so what happens when you get sick is these viruses enter your body and their populations start to go up. And when you have a whole bunch in your body, that's when you're feeling really, really sick. But what also happens is that your immune system starts to also go up. And eventually, your immune system wins. Eventually, your immune system catches up to the virus, beats it out, ideally in most cases, and the number of viruses goes down, and your immune system numbers start to go down because you don't need them anymore. The virus is gone. But here's the trick. Over here, we were starting out with very few of those things that recognize this virus. But your body doesn't forget. It always keeps some of those things that recognize that virus around. And so this number never goes back down to 0 like it was over here. And so what happens the next time you encounter a virus is you've got the high number of immune system elements. The virus moves in just a little bit, and it gets beat up right away. Because you get a massive surge of immune system elements to crash that down. And so what's really going on when you get a vaccination is we give you something that has what's called an antigen that looks like the virus to your immune system. And so your immune system sees that, and it says, well, wait a minute. This is something that's foreign in my body. I want to kill it. Your immune system wants to kill foreign things. It doesn't know that it's not alive. It doesn't know that it's not a real virus. And so what happens is it builds a memory of those chemical characteristics. And then when you encounter that virus again, that virus, or if you encounter it, has those same chemical characteristics. So your body's able to mount a complete and rapid response to it. You actually give yourself immunity when you get a cold. When you get a cold and your body beats it, you have a memory, and that's why you don't trade colds back and forth with your friends or family. One person gets it, another person gets it, another one does, and then they don't give it back to that original person. You have managed to build up immunity. And we just do that artificially through vaccinations. So, that is something important to understand for your daily lives. Let's go ahead and move on. Bacteria are single-celled. They are found everywhere. And as we mentioned earlier in the semester, their genetic material is not contained within a nucleus. They reproduce asexually. They're single-celled. Millions of bacterial species exist, and they are far more metabolically diverse than plants or animals. So they have a lot of funky things going on in the way they use and process energy. And we've got different shapes. There's more shapes than this, but these are the classic ones. Cocci, which basically means round. Bacilli, which basically means rod-shaped. And we've got spirochete. There's also spirillum that are like these. These are spiral-shaped bacteria. So how do humans and bacteria interact together? Well, one way is in the digestive tract. You have some bacteria that live with you in a mutualistic fashion. And so what do we mean by that? Well, basically, inside your digestive tract, you have some bacteria. The bacteria get a nice place to live, but they help you digest things. And so that's what a mutualism is. It's when two organisms interact and they both positively and they both benefit. And in this case, it happens to be going on all the time inside your gut. In fact, these bacteria are so important that if you're lacking them, you get very, very sick. And what we actually have now is a procedure called a fecal transplant, where if you lose these bacteria in your intestines for some reason, what they will do is they will take feces from another individual, insert it into your rectum, such that you get the species of bacteria that are important to repopulate your digestive tract. That's how important they are. And so there's a picture of that. Bacteria and human diseases. All right. Only a small portion of them are disease-causing, but those that are responsible for some very bad diseases. And the key thing is that bacteria are everywhere. Everywhere you look, everywhere you can imagine around you, there are bacteria. Your hand, covered with bacteria right now. You can wash it tons and tons of times. But no matter what you do, there are still going to be some bacteria on that hand. And so, because bacteria are everywhere, you need to be concerned about them. This is why we use things like hygiene and things like that. You use refrigeration to stop bacteria from growing. You are really concerned about bacteria in a lot of ways. One way you can know they're everywhere is, have you ever been driving down the road near where you live and you see a deer that's been hit on the side of the road and it's dead? And you drive by one day, it seems pretty fresh. But what's going to happen to that deer? It's going to start rotting, right, over time? And eventually you'll see it get bigger and bloated. And eventually what's going to happen is it's going to totally decay. But somewhere in there kind of fills up with air. When that bacteria, or when that deer fills up with air, it's because of all those bacteria that are on it digesting it. And they're producing gases as a byproduct of the metabolism. Just kind of like you breathe out CO2. And this deer, where did the bacteria come from that started to digest it? Well, they were already there. They were already on the deer around it. But what was going on is that deer's immune system was keeping those bacteria in check. When the deer died, its immune system stopped to function, and the bacteria had a huge party. They went crazy. Some of them blew in from other places and things, but most of them were already there, and they started digesting it. And so bacteria are around you all the time. Many of them are opportunistic and can only take advantage of things that are dead. Those are the decomposers. But some of them are diseases that are around and really bad. The bacteria generally do their damage by releasing toxins, and our main way to work with bacteria is through antibiotics. And the first antibiotic was discovered in the 1940s, and antibiotics work by exploiting the differences between bacterial and human cells. And what this means is it's pretty cool. Let's actually go to the board for this. So bacteria are produced by typically fungus. But why, antibiotics are produced by fungus. But why do fungus produce antibiotics? Well, remember that log we had rotting in the forest and those decomposers were going to get on it, right? Those decomposers both want to eat the log. They want to digest it and break it into little pieces and use that for energy. And what you have is you have the fungi growing on the log here, and they're breaking it down. But they're not the only ones there. There's also bacteria. And so what you have are two organisms in competition with each other for the same resource. And when two organisms are in competition with each other for the same resource, they're reducing each other's fitness. And so the bacteria, by having fungus there, have reduced fitness, and the fungus, by having bacteria there, have reduced fitness. And one day, what happens a long time ago in evolutionary history is this fungus starts to produce a substance. And this substance has a negative impact on the fitness of the bacteria. It reduces their survival and reproduction. And what that means is this fungus, with that ability, is better able to survive and reproduce than all the fungus that don't have that ability. And so what happens is through evolution, we start to get the production of antibiotics. These are a means by which the fungus can both stop competitors as well as those bacteria that might directly try to eat the fungus themselves. Some bacteria would try to be parasitic on the fungus. And over evolutionary time, we get lots of different antibiotics toward lots of different types of bacteria. And what happens is eventually humans discover this ability of antibiotics to hurt bacteria. We discover these chemicals. We notice that they hurt bacteria. And here's what's awesome. These chemicals hurt bacteria but not eukaryotic cells. They only will hurt the prokaryotic bacterial cells. So what does this mean? It means you can take antibiotics. They do not have a negative effect on your body, but they will have a negative effect on the bacteria. Because the things that those chemicals target are not things that would hurt a eukaryotic cell. And so you can pop all these antibiotics, they don't hurt you, but they do hurt the bacteria. So, however, the power of antibiotics is being threatened by the emergence of antibiotic resistance bacteria. And this is causing, in this case, let's go back to this example, this would have been called an evolutionary arms race. Because as the fungus is evolving to produce this nasty substance which kills bacteria, which bacteria survive and reproduce the best? Well, the bacteria that survive and reproduce the best are those that are most resistant to the antibiotics. And so what happens is the bacteria become resistant, and then the fungus evolves an antibiotic that's a little stronger. The bacteria become more resistant. The fungus evolves. More resistant, the fungus evolves, and so on. It's evolutionary arms race. They're always trying to one-up each other. More poison, more resistance. More poison, more resistance. All the way up. And what ultimately has happened is that when we humans take antibiotics, we've been using them in huge extents, in massive amounts. And so some species of bacteria have evolved to be antibiotic resistant. And in this case, the arms race is between the antibiotic resistant bacteria and scientists who are trying to develop antibiotics to kill them. If you've ever heard of MRSA, the acronym MRSA just stands for meth something, whatever, resistant bacteria. Staphylococcus, actually. And so what's going on is that we are losing the war in some places, the evolutionary arms race. In some places, the bacteria's ability to resist our antibiotics has outpaced our ability to make them. All right, archaea. Archaea are cool organisms. Once they were thought to be like bacteria, but we know from genetic information and the structure of their membranes that they are more closely related to eukarya, actually. So we've got these two domains. And like I said, they look like bacteria. If I was to show you an archaea and a bacteria under a microscope, you could not tell the difference between them. They exist in large numbers in some common environments. We find them in the oceans a lot and things like that. But what we really see of them that's cool is that many species of archaea are extremophiles. They like to live in weird regions that are normally not tolerant of other forms of life. And so we have things like thermophiles. These are just examples. There's other extreme environments. There's baryophiles for pressure. There's things that do well with cold, all sorts of things. Thermophiles, in this case, can live in incredibly hot environments where other organisms normally couldn't live, like, say, near a thermal deep-sea vent. Archaea are getting that done. Halophiles, extremely salty environments. Think of the Great Salt Lake. Not everything can live in there. The concentration of salt is too high. But archaea that are halophiles can do it. There are many archaea that are anaerobes. These do well with or without oxygen, and some of them are actually poisoned by it. So they survive in places without oxygen. And so these are three examples, but if you can think of a crazy place for something to live that's extreme, archaea are probably the ones that are there. All right, on to another class of microbes, the protists. And a protist is a eukaryotic organism that does not have the defining features of a plant, animal, or fungus. I'll show you something about that in a second. It's basically an unsatisfactory definition, because we've thrown a bunch of things together. And what we mean by that is, if you look at this graph here, or this chart, I should say, up here you have the eukaryotes. Eukaryotes have three terminal branches that are other kingdoms, that are the plants, fungi, and animals. But we also have tons of other terminal branches that are protists. But what we've done, as opposed to giving them their own kingdoms, and we just tossed them into a group. Protists can be as different from each other as plants are to animals, but because they're single-celled eukaryotic organisms, we've lumped them all together. And protists are mostly microscopic. They tend to live in moist aquatic environments. Some of them are photosynthetic. And in fact, we used to divide protists up into plant-like protists and animal-like protists. And these first ones that we're talking about are the plant-like protists. That's kind of their defining feature, was that they were photosynthetic. And these guys get their nutrition through photosynthesis, just like the plants we talked about earlier today. Interesting thing, algae. Here we get a species that's kind of going from single-cellular to multicellular. Remember, the other two domains, eukarya and archaea, are all single-cell. But eukaryotes contain multicellular organisms. And in something like algae, we get clonal multicellularity. And what this means here is that these organisms form stable associations with one another, but they don't take on specialized roles. However, there are some algal protists that have true multicellularity. And so what we see in this group is kind of a way we can envision a transition of going from single-celled to multi-celled organisms, where single cells that were, for whatever reason, able to work together, form stable associations, ultimately become organisms that are multicellular. They develop from one cell and then make more cells that are like them to make part of a whole body. Microscopic algae are important members of the group of organisms known as phytoplankton. Phytoplankton are the photosynthesizing organisms that you find in the oceans. Like when you think of a whale cruising around and filter feeding, whales with their giant mouths, they don't actually eat big things. Whales actually filter out very tiny microscopic organisms, but in huge quantities to sustain themselves. And so these algae and phytoplankton actually form the base of food chains in aquatic systems. Because remember, you need to have a photosynthesizer at the base of the food chain because they take the inorganic world into the organic world, which all organisms can then use for energy. Phytoplankton are also important because they produce most of the Earth's oxygen. We talked about that last week, about how the Earth was just all carbon dioxide until these guys came and filled it up with oxygen, which made you able to live. Let's move on to the heterotrophic protists, and these are the animal-like. And so what we mean by that is that these actually eat other organisms. A photosynthetic organism can use energy from the sun to bring the inorganic world into the organic one, and then it can use those chemicals that the sun helped it make to get energy. In this case, these guys are going to eat other things that have already done that. So really you can think of it like all the photosynthesizers, they're doing all of the hard work, and then we just come in and take advantage of it by gobbling them up. Some heterotrophic protists, they look like animals, and you can see these. They have flagella and abilities to move. And if you remember how I told you these were going to be like animals, they are. Let's imagine that you have a drop of water. Okay? And this drop of water is just sitting on the ground somewhere. Protists can move, if there's, let's say there's food over here, there's a protist, it might move toward that food. It might move away from something it doesn't like. And so this is why they were animal-like. They were moving and doing things. And the protists are very diverse. You might look out your window, and when you look out your window, you might see, let's say, a squirrel eating a plant, and maybe a fox chases that squirrel. And you've got this whole ecosystem, all these this giant community of interacting organisms. Inside a single drop of water, You can have all those things playing out. You can have protists that are autotrophs, and those autotrophs are producing the base of the food chain. And then you have things that eat them. Those things are in competition with other things. Other protists are eating those protists. And the world inside a drop of water, as far as protists are concerned, can be as elaborate, the food chains can be as elaborate as those that you see in the world that you can see with your naked eye. So, that brings us to the end of our portion on the microorganisms. We will now move on to fungi. I'll give you a second here if anybody wants to ask any questions to go ahead and do that. We'll just give it a moment. All right. It looks like we are good to go on that. So let's move on now to the second, that's the same one again, to the second part here. All right, diversity of life 2, the fungus. So, fungus don't make their own food. They, as plants do, fungus do not make their own food, like plants do, but are heterotrophs, meaning they consume other things that plants have already made. And so fungi consist of large webs of slender tubes called hyphae that grow toward food sources. And they make branching web called mycelium that forms the bulk of most fungus. And so the fungus cannot immediately ingest the food. The way these actually do this is they extend their hyphae, put out enzymes that digest things externally, and then bring those in. And so we should have many fungi have a reproductive structure called the fruiting body, and they all have hyphae. So here is a picture of a fungi. Let's talk about how this is actually living in the real world, though. The fungus in the real world, let's spread this out for a second here, is living by eating other things that were produced by plants. Or in other words, what I mean is plants form the base of the food chain, but fungus are decomposers that can digest those things that are plants or those things that ate the plants. They serve that same role that we talked about earlier today. And so what we have here is what you see in a fungus is only its reproductive structure. What the fungus is it's really a mat of these hyphae. And let's say we're on our log again. We've got all our hyphae in here on the log. And what these are each doing is they're secreting digestive enzymes to the log material, breaking it up into tiny pieces that they've digested, and then absorbing it back in. And let's say that there is a nice rich spot on the log over here where there's lots of good things to eat. They actually kind of have behavior. Well, they will grow their hyphae in that direction toward the greater concentration of resources. It's just like what you might expect in a plant. If you had a plant in a pot, okay, and here's the stem, the plant's up here. The plant has roots. If you only put fertilizer on that side of the pot, the plant will concentrate its root growth on that side. Believe it or not, plants actually exhibit movement in the growth in the way that you might expect animals to behave. And same thing with fungi down here. Fungi grow toward a resource. So they're sending out the enzymes, digesting the resources, and then what happens is eventually the fungus gets enough energy. And what do you think's going to happen when it gets enough energy? When it gets enough energy, that's when you get the fungus that you typically think of. When that fungus gets enough energy, what happens is it grows the mushroom that you're familiar with. That mushroom only exists for the purposes of reproduction. It does not really do anything else. its whole goal is to get a little bit higher, and remember those gills that are down here? In those gills, that black part under a mushroom, it's producing spores and trying to send those spores out into the world. And so you are constantly walking around near fungus. They're everywhere. But you notice them when they're reproducing because they create these very obvious and characteristic structures. Most fungus, moving on, most fungus are multicellular. The primary exception to this are yeasts. Yeast are single-celled fungus. Fungi in society. Fungus cause a great number of crop diseases. They cause infections. You know, you've heard of people getting fungal infections. They can cause food poisoning. But they're also the source of medicines and used in food processing. So fungus do a lot of things. We already mentioned these were decomposers. They break down dead organic material, such as a fallen tree trunk or a dead animal on the side of the road, like we talked about. We already talked about the fruiting body in a fungi. The mushroom cap is basically made up of accordion-like gills. These produce spores, which the fungus releases into the world. Only a fraction of these actually germinate, so fungus have to make tons and tons of these in order to successfully reproduce. And this is kind of the fungus life cycle, and like we talked about, save up energy, eventually once you've got enough grow, reproduce, make gills, send out spores. Most fungi can reproduce asexually, although sometimes they do have a form of sexual reproduction. Categories of fungi. These are just the 4 groupings. We will not cover all these in much depth today. You can read about and look at the pictures of these organisms in your book, but there are these 4 major phyla. Yeast are not within a single phyla, but they spread out among phyla. As we mentioned before, these are single-celled fungus, and as such, they act a lot like other single-celled organisms. In fact, yeasts are great for genetic engineering. The reason is if we want to make a product inside of a cell, yeast are single-celled eukaryotic organisms, so they're easy to work with. They have the same sort of machinery as other eukaryotic cells. And so yeast are extensively used in genetic engineering. And yeast has played very important roles in society through making beer, wine, bread, and stuff like that. Let's take a moment to show you how that yeast makes bread rise. Right? We like nice, fluffy bread. And really, the way yeast does that is similar to the same story that we've been telling all day about decomposers. They're breaking down organic things to get their energy. In this case, you've got the yeast. Let's say we've got our bread, right? Here's our bread. It has not risen yet. It's just sitting there. What we're going to do is fill that up with yeast. And here's what's interesting that occurs. The yeast, like the other fungus, starts to secrete digestive enzymes out, break down some of that bread, and suck back in all those resources. In doing so, it operates just like you. What it's going to do as a byproduct of doing this is it's going to produce carbon dioxide. Just like you do. Lots of CO2. And what happens, that carbon dioxide gets trapped inside the dough, and that's where you get these air bubbles inside, and so your bread rises. At that point, it's full of CO2, and many, many yeasts that have divided and reproduced, that was a happy life. That bread was full of yummy things for them to eat, just like it was good for you. And so we get our bread to rise. There's a picture of some yeast. All right. On to lichens. Lichens are an association of fungus and bacteria. And so what happens in this case is either fungus and algae or fungus and bacteria work together. This is another mutualistic relationship. The lichen has photosynthesizing algae or bacteria that supply the fungus with food, while the fungus supplies the algae with water, minerals, carbon dioxide, and protection from the elements, all these things. And so really, they're this mixture that's a mutual, with both these organisms working together so that they both benefit. Interesting thing about lichens is they tend to be found in areas with very clean air. For whatever reason, they're very susceptible to pollution, and so the more lichens you find in an area, the more certain you can be that it's an area that's healthier. Not a guarantee, but it's a kind of a bioindicator is what that's called. And so you can see here, lichens can be very diverse and cool looking, and obviously you know the green ones here are very photosynthetic, and even these are too. Mycorrhizae, these are another way where plants and animals interact with each other. And the way this is set up is plant root looks like that, let's say, right? It only has so much surface area to absorb something. And I believe we talked about this a little last week, just this outer edge. What the fungus does is it grows around this plant root. And by growing around the plant root, what it's done is these little filaments of the fungus that stick off the sides here increase its surface area. They increase the amount of ground that this is coming into contact with. By virtue of coming into contact with more ground, what this is going to do is be able to better absorb things. It's going to be better able to take things from the environment and bring them in. In turn, what the fungus is doing is stealing a little bit of those sugars that the plants are sending down to their roots. If you're not 100% certain what I mean by sugars plants are sending down to the roots, what? Don't worry about it. That's where we're going to transition into next week when we talk about plants. So, with that, we are at the end of the lesson today on microorganisms and fungi. I hope you've all learned something, and now I'll give you an opportunity to ask any questions. If you have any, go ahead and ask them now. If not, we'll go ahead and end the presentation. All right, it looks like we do not have any questions. And so with that, I'm going to say thank you for attending, and I hope you enjoyed this. And I will see you next week.